Who is Rick Mehta, and why is his university trying to shut him up? That's my subject on today's Fiamengo File. I'm Janice Fiamengo of the University of Ottawa. Rick Mehta is a professor of psychology at Acadia University in Nova Scotia, Canada. He's a free speech advocate who cares far more about reason-based analysis than political correctness. All you have to do is read his Twitter feed to see his willingness to talk about many of today's ever-increasing number of forbidden subjects. Among other topics, Rick has posted about the controversial subject of residential schools to support the idea that we should listen to the voices of all Indigenous people, including those who say their experience at such schools was positive. He has posted critical comments about multiculturalism and identity politics. He has questioned feminist views about the wage gap between men and women. He has advocated that talk of rape culture and patriarchy are false and counterproductive, and that the Me Too movement is a disaster for due process. And he insists that freedom of expression is under attack at Canadian and American universities and in Western society generally, and that we should all be concerned about that. Radical ideas. True to form, the students, professors, and activists who consider themselves social justice warriors have been outraged by Professor Mehta's refusal to toe their line about what can and cannot be said in a university classroom. And they're causing trouble for him by claiming that he is making students unsafe. This is the predictable ruse of such people when their monopoly on ideas is challenged. One of them, a woman calling herself a human rights activist, started an online petition to have Mehta removed from the university altogether on the grounds that marginalized communities in Nova Scotia can't feel comfortable with him teaching at Acadia. A counter petition calling on Acadia to support Professor Mehta actually garnered more than double, the number of the attack petition, suggesting that Professor Mehta has far more supporters than detractors amongst both students and the wider community. But unfortunately, the university is showing itself all too willing to kowtow to the SJWs. In response to a never-disclosed number of complaints, university administrators have moved to place restrictions on the courses that Professor Mehta can teach and on how he is allowed to teach his courses. A letter from his designated department head, Rob Rayside, dated February 26, couldn't cite a single racist or transphobic utterance by Professor Mehta, but claimed that the tension level among students in his classes was so high that some students couldn't bring themselves to attend class. And instead of politely informing the grousing students that they should attend class and were free to engage in reason-based discussion with their professor on all the matters he was raising, the head instead told Mehta to conform to their sweeping demands. He actually told the teacher to avoid using any material, quote, that might be seen by students as advancing a fringe point of view, end quote, and to be, quote, very diligent about avoiding any comments that might be perceived as racist or transphobic, end quote. Notice the Weasley phrasing. Professor Mehta is not barred from making racist or transphobic comments, which there is zero evidence he did make. He is barred from making comments, quote, that might be perceived as racist or transphobic, end quote. Well, since nearly any unorthodox commentary will be perceived as advancing a, quote, fringe perspective, and since any deviation from the leftist line on social issues is automatically labeled racist and transphobic by the social justice left, the department head's directive essentially concedes to totalitarian students the right to dictate what Professor Mehta is and is not allowed to say in his own classroom. Talk about the tail wagging the dog. Even more critically, Acadia University's Vice President Academic Heather Hemming has now launched a formal investigation into the complaints against Mehta, hiring a man named Wayne McKay, retired professor from nearby Dalhousie University in Halifax, to look into the allegations of discrimination and harassment. Professor McKay, as it happens, is a declared enemy of free speech who has publicly endorsed university's supposed mandate to protect marginalized students from expressions they might find offensive. In response to a scandal some years ago in 2014 involving dentistry students' Facebook posts at Dal, he opined in a newspaper piece that, quote, all speech has its reasonable limits, end quote, and that it is important to prohibit, quote, hate speech, targeting identifiable groups and discriminatory speech more broadly, end quote. Well, that doesn't bode well. Notice how hate speech, which is an already fuzzy and bloated term, isn't broad enough for Professor McKay, who wants unacceptable speech to include anything, even not hateful, that can be alleged to be, as he calls it, discriminatory, whatever that means, i.e., probably anything that a member of a protected group can claim produced discomfort. As a side note, McKay is also a big-time feminist activist who mentioned in this 2014 piece, quote, the alleged conduct of Jian Ghomeshi as a tragedy that revealed the deep-rooted misogyny of Canadian culture. In other words, he believed women's allegations, believed those as themselves proof of what was alleged. So what are the chances that Professor McKay will not find Rick Mehta's alleged speech to have crossed the line into discriminatory discourse? So not surprisingly, the SJW sharks are now circling. A Canadian Press article about the university investigation quoted an associate professor of classics and ancient history at the University of New Brunswick, one Matthew Sears, who was quick to offer a diagnosis, and a not very charitable one, of Professor Mehta's motivations and objectives. Quote, he's just sort of parroting the much more popular Jordan Peterson, Sears said, just a little dismissively. Quote, he's very clearly just trying to piggyback on that to gain a certain notoriety, end quote. Of course, the classics prof didn't offer any evidence to support his contention that Mehta is insincere, and nor did he feel the need to justify his outrageous contention quoted later in the same article that Mehta is, quote, an ignoramus about residential schools and, wait for it, a racist. In a more civil era, it would have been extraordinary to see one professor publicly calling another a racist merely because that professor questions received ideas about residential schools. Unfortunately, the tried and true method of academic elites today is simply to name call. It's little wonder that some university students now are so intolerant that they resort to illegal disruption, intimidation, and even violence to prevent points of view they don't like from being heard, always with the claim that such points of view make students unsafe. I wonder how safe students feel disagreeing with a professor like Matthew Sears, whose trigger finger for firing off claims of racism is worrisomely itchy. In my opinion, the extremely uncivil remarks of Professor Sears, as well as the ridiculous directives in the letter from the department head, and the fact that Professor Mehta is now under investigation by someone who has already declared himself a foe of free speech, all these provide a pretty appalling picture of the hostile climate in which teachers are forced to operate these days at universities. Acadia University, like way too many other post-secondary institutions, has become indoctrinate you. And the radical profs who once marched for free speech are now the ones shutting it down.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please support us on Patreon. If even half of our subscribers gave us $1 per month, we'd be well on our way to creating more and better content. And don't forget to subscribe to us on Studio Brule.